This week on Engage the Sage.
Hi, everyone. I'm Don Saucer. Welcome to this week's episode of Engage the Sage. This week, I want to talk to you about writing. Writing is awesome. Writing is the act of using your voice in written form to express and amplify your message to an audience of readers. It's a great way to get your ideas out there, and writing is so important. It's so important that if you're a student, if you're a professor, if you're an instructor, you probably should be writing right now. You probably have things to write. You probably have things that you want to write. But there's probably a reason you're not writing them. And the reason you're not writing them right this second is that writing is hard. Whether you're writing a manuscript, a grant proposal, a term paper, a weekly reflection, even an email, it is hard to get your thoughts down in a way that is going to be digestible and accessible to your reader, and to make sure you're getting your point across in a way that is not going to be misunderstood. Writing is a task that can be intimidating and it can be labor intensive. I've found that this is one of the hardest skills for me to develop in myself. It's also one of the hardest skills for me to help my students learn. I'm going to share with you today 4 cues that I use to focus my own writing, and 4 cues that I use to help teach my students how to focus their writing. These are practical tips, these are easy to remember tips, and I think it's going to make it easier for you to write and easier for you to teach writing with your students. These 4 cues help me with all of my writing. It's not just writing the big things. It's not just writing manuscripts and grant proposals and things like that. It even helps me write things, the small things, even down to an email to a colleague. I think there are things that can make our writing better at all levels. These 4 cues are easy to remember because they all start with C. So today we're going to bring you the 4 C's of writing, and I hope that these 4 things help you focus your writing and help your students focus theirs. And I even recommend, if you'd like, have your students watch this video so they can learn the 4 C's for themselves to improve their writing. The 4 C's of writing are to be clear, complete, concise, and compelling. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk a little bit more about each one. The first C of writing is to be clear. And I will admit, I am not an expert in grammar. In fact, if you've watched this YouTube channel before, and I hope you have, you know that I am not an expert in grammar. I mess up grammar all the time. Sometimes I even make up my own words. But I do know the purpose of writing is to convey a message. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to make sure that the messages that I put out there in my writing are going to be as clear as possible to my audience so they don't misunderstand what it is I'm writing for. So these are some specific things that I do to be clear in my writing. I try to use active voice whenever I can. I try to use first person pronouns in my writing, words like I and we, whenever I can. Throughout my writing, I try to use parallel terms, consistent sentence structure, and things like that. So my audience is focused on understanding what I'm saying, not trying to figure out what I'm trying to say. I don't try to sound smart in my writing. I just use the simplest words that I can to get my point across. Because if I were to just take the fanciest terms, the fanciest words that I could use, this wouldn't be authentic for me. It would probably make my writing less clear. I also make the goal of my narrative very clear to my audience so they know what it is that they're reading. The second C of writing is to be complete. So to do this, one of the first things that I do is I make sure that I understand what the content is supposed to be, what the format is supposed to be, what the scope, what the length, all of those things. So that when I'm writing to a goal. And as I'm going through it, I'm accomplishing all the goals. In my own writing, I don't use formal outlines. And if you use formal outlines in yours, that's completely and totally fine. You do what works for you. But outlines don't work for me. But what I do, and this is something that I found is really helpful for me, is I tend to write the first sentence of each paragraph in the document that I'm writing so that I know where my narrative is going. By knowing the first sentence of the next paragraph, it really helps me understand what this paragraph needs to do to get to there. And by knowing where that next paragraph is going to start, it really helps me transition well between my paragraphs. So it's not that my paragraphs are kind of randomly inserted, it's my paragraphs are part of a story, and I know what the next point in that story is. Another advantage of writing the first sentence of each paragraph in, say, a manuscript is that when I'm trying to decide where to put my sources, where to put my references, it's a lot clearer for me to know where they fit and if they don't fit, because I know what those paragraphs are supposed to do. And I'll admit, one of the hardest things for me as a writer is that sometimes, I'll read an article and to admit that that article doesn't fit in the manuscript that I'm writing. Because well, I read that, I want to fit that in somewhere. By setting out those sentences, it lets me know, hey, that's not going in this manuscript because it simply doesn't fit. So by knowing those goals throughout the products that I'm writing, it helps me to be complete in my writing. The third C of writing is to be concise. And to be honest, this is something that I've struggled with over the course of my career. When I was in graduate school, my mentor told me that my writing was verbose, And she was right. I like to use lots of words. I like to use lots of pages. I thought longer was better in my writing. So that if I could say it in 15 words, why say it in 5? And this is something I've really had to work on over the course of my career to make my writing more streamlined and concise. Now, the good thing about having learned to be more concise in my writing is that I found that I almost always, when writing a manuscript or a grant proposal or something like that, I have page limits, word limits, or character limits that I'm coming up against. So by focusing my writing being more concise, I'm finding that I'm better able to get my writing within those limits and still be complete, like I mentioned in the last point. To be concise, I focus on being direct, logical, and progressive in my writing. I make every sentence count. I make every sentence and every phrase move the story and the narrative forward. There is nothing in my writing when I'm writing well, there's nothing in my writing that doesn't need to be there. There's nothing in my writing that doesn't make the story better. Some of the things I do to make my writing more concise is I cut out redundancy. I try not to say the same things again and again. I cut out road mapping statements. Road mapping statements are when you tell the reader what's coming next. Rather than telling the reader what's coming next is I just do the thing that comes next. And if I do it in a direct, logical, progressive way, the reader doesn't need the road mapping. Another way that I make my writing more concise is I cut out adjectives. I use adjectives a lot when I talk, but I use them rarely when I write. I try to pick the best verbs and nouns that I can, and I avoid the adjectives that tend to clutter up my writing. Another thing I found really helpful for me is I focus on short, direct sentences. And I'll have a lot of sentences, but I have a lot of short, direct sentences rather than those really long run-on sentences with lots of conjunctions and semicolons and all of those kind of things that are really hard to follow. I find that my writing is more powerful when it is concise with short and direct sentences. I focus in my writing on using an economy of words. And what I mean is I try to use the fewest words possible to make my point. And for any of you who watch me speak, obviously I have different standards for when I talk. The fourth C of writing is to be compelling. Being compelling is the hardest one of these 4 Qs, in my opinion. It's something I struggle with. It's something I know my students struggle with. The key to being compelling, and this is something I try not to lose sight of when I'm writing, is to write something that the audience wants to read. I strive to let my reader know what they're reading, why they're reading it, and why it's important. I try to make the points that I'm writing about not only clear, as I've mentioned before, but also compelling, engaging, interesting. As I've mentioned, I try to use powerful verbs and go light on the adjectives. I explicitly tell my readers what they're reading, why it's important, and what the contribution of my narrative is. I think one of the most helpful ways that has helped me make my writing more compelling is to try to inspire my reader to think while they are reading. I try to say things that are going to lead the reader to think their own thoughts and elaborate on what I'm saying to engage them in the narrative that I'm sharing with them. I also try to offer a takeaway conclusion at the end of my writing so that my readers, when they're done, find that they took something valuable from it. There's a reason that they invested in the time in my narrative, and they felt like that was a good investment of their time. In my writing, I try to avoid cliches. Use them sometimes when I talk, and I'm talking now. So at the end of my writing, to make it compelling, try to end in a high note, try to stick the landing, and I try to drop the mic. So these are the 4 C's of writing. And I think if you focus on being clear, complete, concise, and compelling, it's going to improve your writing, and it's going to help you improve the writing of your students when you help them to focus on being clear, complete, concise, and compelling. Now, one thing I am going to add to this is that one of the things I found in improving my own writing is it takes a lot of practice and it takes a lot of revision. So when I'm going through my writing, it takes time. It is a labor-intensive process. It is an intimidating process, but writing is awesome. It's a great way to get my thoughts out there so someone else can read them and think about them. So plan to spend some time revising, but revising is improvement. It's not wasted time. It's making your writing better. Thank you for watching this video about writing. I really hope the 4 C's on writing, being clear, complete, concise, and compelling, are going to help make writing better for you and for your students. I found that by emphasizing these, it has made writing not only better, but a more enjoyable process for me. In the comments below, I am excited to hear your thoughts about writing. I'm excited to hear how you make writing better for you. I'm excited to hear how you teach writing to your students. And in particular, I want to hear how you make writing more enjoyable for you and your students. Please like, subscribe, sign up for notifications, and share us on social media. And we'll see you next time on Engage the Sage.